This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about voting and demographics with Andrew Gelman, professor of statistics at Columbia University and author of Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Why Americans Vote the Way They Do. Andrew Gelman is professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University. His new book, Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, crunches demographic and voting data together and finds some counterintuitive and very fascinating conclusions. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
After the 2004 presidential election here in the U.S., the satirical newspaper The Onion ran a headline that said, "Nations poor win election for nations rich." And I'm guessing by the content of your book and your findings, you wouldn't agree with that analysis, would you?
No, I wouldn't. The Republicans won the election, and they do better among the rich voters. If the richest 5% of voters were a state, they're as Republican as Texas or Kansas. And if the poorest 1/6 of Americans were a state, they're as Democratic as Massachusetts.
So if the nation's poor didn't win the election for the party, then who did?
For one thing, the election was very close, so a small change in public opinion could have been enough to swing it either way. But sure, Bush won more from the richer voters, the more religious voters, and he did less well among the lower income and the secular voters.
Now I want to get right to the central paradox of your book, and it is that rich states go for the Democrats, whereas rich voters go for Republicans on an individual level when they're actually in the voting booth. What numbers lie behind that fighting? What behind that finding? What's the data there?
How the states vote is you can just make the map and look at the election returns. So that data are available to anybody. How the individual voters vote, you can get from exit polls. If you go on the CNN webpage, it'll actually tell you can actually look up voting by income, by education level, and by a whole bunch of other things. So the information is really all there for anybody to analyze. What we did, which was a little bit more innovative, was that we analyzed the survey data within each state. And that's where we learned that although throughout the country rich people are more likely to vote Republican, that pattern is stronger in some parts of the country than others.
And so why then, in a state that's actually wealthier, would that be more likely to, as a whole, go Democratic?
Well, in richer states such as New York and California, people are socially more liberal than in poor states. Especially richer people are socially more liberal. So you look at California is a clear case, with California is the most gay rights supporting state in the country. Most of the states in the U.S., if they were going to have a referendum about gay marriage, it wouldn't even be close. And in California, it could go either way. Social issues are more important than they used to be in how people voted. But although California is more liberal, New York is more liberal, within these states, you still find the richer people voting for the Republicans.
One of the themes of your book is that at the level of the voter who is wealthy, the voter who is influential, the voter who is elite, the priorities that they vote on seem to be different. How different are they for the rich voter than the poor voter?
People talk about the opiate of the masses, the idea that religious and social issues distract low-income voters from their real concerns. But when we look at the data, we actually say it's the opiate of the elites, that it's actually lower-income voters are voting more based on economic issues. Things like religion and social issues are more of a dividing line among better-off voters.
So how has it come about, this public perception? And you have many quotes from pundits quoting various ideas that you shoot down later. And sometimes the ideas you have to shoot down are themselves contradictory, but where did this one come from that has people think that poor people will vote based on God, essentially, whereas you find that's not the case at all?
Well, yeah, I find it very frustrating, and it was actually interesting because political pundit recently was commenting on that Sarah Palin and Todd Palin, their snowmobile vacations, and pointing out that snowmobiling is a sort of conservative thing to do. It's not really a working class thing. It's expensive. Snowmobiles cost a lot. As the pundit put it, you could buy a lot of arugula for one snowmobile. And so one way we like to think about it is that it's not the Prius versus the pickup truck, it's the Prius versus the Hummer. There really is a culture war in terms of how people vote, but that culture war is more among higher income, more politically involved citizens. So if you look back, how does this come up? I think that journalists are more politically involved. They're more likely to know higher income people. And I think for them, a lot of these cultural divisions are very sharp and stark and clear. In the country as a whole, the sort of red state, blue state divide is huge among the rich, moderate among the middle class, and disappears among the poor. It gets me angry a little bit when I think well-meaning journalists and pundits who end up trying so hard to speak for people they don't know. So they're saying, well, I can imagine how those poor people must think. They must be voting this way because of distractions, because of God's guns and gays. It's a little bit insulting, to these. There's a poor person. For one thing, most of the poor people vote for Democrats. So to say the poor people are voting Republican because blah, blah, blah is just wrong. But then second, I think poor people who vote Republican, they have a lot of reasonable reasons to do so based on economic ideologies and supporting low taxes and so forth.
So how much of this talk in the pundit sector, or wherever, even the more legitimate journalist sector, how much of this talk of a culture war can be explained by journalistic insularity then? You mentioned how, of course, journalists live in areas that aren't normal as far as the demographics and the voting that happens because of them.
Right. I think that we're in states like California, New York, Maryland, and Virginia, the differences between rich and poor are actually smaller, and so it's easier for journalists to think that the world's turned upside down and people vote the wrong way, that sort of thing. In the country as a whole, rich people vote 15 to 20% more Republican than poor people, and they've been doing that for a couple of decades. And another way of looking at it is to say, I think on the right, let's say you have people who might not want to admit that poor people vote Democratic because they feel they want Republican Party to have the legitimacy that you get from being the party of the people. On the left, you have commentators, very intelligent people who just feel that how come George Bush is getting even 40% of the poor voters, right? Like, how come they're voting for him at all? And they're upset. But if you go back decades and decades, go back to the 1940s, the post-New Deal period, and back then, rich people were voting Republican about 20% more than poor people. At least going back to the 40s, there has never been a golden age in which there was pure class-based voting. Voting is as class-based as it's ever been in the United States, but that's only a certain amount. And I do think it's partly an all-or-nothing thing. If you start by believing that it's going to be purely class-based, and then you see some data showing it's not, there's maybe a tendency for people to sort of spring back like a rubber band and ignore the differences that are there.
And how much of the research and the findings from the research in your book was an exercise in that, was an exercise in having to discard a lot of preconceptions about this sort of thing, because there are so many. Did you have to hold back any that you might have been subject to yourself in order to find these things from these numbers?
Well, I did. In fact, we have 5 authors on this book. It's myself and 4 former students, and 2 of us are Democrats and 2 of us are Republicans. One is a Mexican citizen. And when we were writing this book, we were continually having to tell each other. One thing one of my co-authors said to the other one was, you're writing what a liberal thinks a conservative thinks. And then the other person was saying, well, you're a reasonable conservative, but I have to think of how this ordinary voters view it. So yeah, I certainly have my own filters, and so much of it is context. So take California. If you look at San Francisco, if not the richest county in the state of California, is one of the richest. And if not the most democratic county in the state, it's one of the most democratic. Suppose you take a person who makes $60,000. Now you put them in San Francisco, and they are going to be highly likely to vote for the Democrats. And also in San Francisco, someone who makes $60,000, if that's their family income, they're not doing so well. They're on the poor side of San Franciscans. You put them in a low-income county in California, and you're going to find that they're relatively rich, and also you're going to find that they're much more likely to vote Republican. And so at the level of voters, where you are is providing a lot of information. And so it's inevitable that where I am is affecting how I think. And that's one reason in the book that we tried very carefully to lay out the data rather than to just sort of present conclusions. So then if someone sees something, that they can read the data their own way if they want.
You reference in your book, more than once you reference Thomas Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas? And what you say in your book is that what's the matter with Kansas is not the most interesting question that you can ask. More like, what's the matter with Connecticut? Now, what matter would there be with Connecticut?
In Connecticut, rich people and poor people vote the same. So Connecticut's the only state in the country where rich people are no more Republican than poor people. And George W. Bush got about 45% of the vote among every income category in Connecticut.
So that's sort of funny. So, what's going on, right?
The richest people in Connecticut are fairly economically conservative, but they're also quite socially liberal. And they're a little bit torn in how they're going to vote. It's unusual because in most of the states you don't see that. You don't see the kind of conflict that splits the rich people 50-50 like that.
And then in the rich states like Connecticut, what are the issues that divide the vote if they're not class-based economic issues?
Well, religion is still a big dividing factor. People who go to church are much more likely to vote Republican than people who don't go to church. And that's occurring in Connecticut as well as other places.
I want to talk a little bit about the comparison you make, an international comparison between the U.S. and Mexico. Now, what makes that a good set of data to work with? What about the U.S. and Mexico make them good to compare with each other?
The U.S. and Mexico have a lot of similarities. So Mexico, like the U.S., the politics are regionally divided. The current governing party in Mexico, the PAN, is a conservative Catholic party that's strongest in the north of the country, the part most closest to the United States. The more left-wing parties in Mexico are strongest in the south, the center of Mexico. So it's very much like the U.S., where the Republican Party is strong in the south and the Democrats are strong in the north. It's a little different, so it's an interesting comparison because in Mexico, the place where the conservatives are strong is the richer part of the country. Mexico is sort of like the U.S. used to be 60 years ago. It used to be that the Republicans are strong in the north and the Democrats are strong in the south, and now things have switched. So Mexico, in some ways, could be viewed as representing the past of the U.S., that the Conservative Party is strongest in the most economically industrialized, dynamic parts of the country. But then within individual Mexican states, usually a pattern of generally richer people voting more conservative. I really felt this was important to include Mexico because, in the U.S. we're sort of insular, and whenever someone wants to explain a political phenomenon, they'll tend to do it in terms of U.S. history. So they'll say, why is this happening? It's because of Franklin Roosevelt, or it's because of the South, or the legacy of slavery, or the Sun Belt. There's always these idiosyncratic explanations. So if you see similar things happening in other countries, then it makes you feel like there might be something a little bit deeper going on.
Now, what happened in the U.S. to change it from the situation you can see going on in Mexico right now to how it is currently, that changing of the geographical distribution of party allegiances?
The South was key, and in the 1960s there was something called the one-person, one-vote revolution. The Supreme Court had two cases where they ruled that legislative districts and congressional districts within any state had to be of equal size. So what that meant was that in the South, especially, before the Supreme Court rulings of the 60s, the rural areas of the South were way overrepresented. When the Supreme Court did these rulings, decreed one man, one vote, one person, one vote, it increased the power of the urban and suburbs in the South and decreased the power of the rural areas. Well, that actually made the South a perfect fit for the Republican Party because the rural South was very economically liberal and racially extremely conservative. That's what was the Democratic Party's strength in the South. Once more power was given to the cities and suburbs, that strengthened the votes of economically more conservative and racially more moderate groups in the South, and that became a much better fit for the Republican Party. Then in recent decades, you've seen places like Connecticut and so forth, voters reacting to that and saying, well, I don't want to vote for the Texas Republican Party to run the country. So it's a bit of a pivoting effect. The two parties, when one party moves, then the other party will move correspondingly.
That's something you mentioned in the book, how in the last 20 years there's been especially more party polarization. Now, is there an event to set that off, or is it just something that happens to have been a trend in the last 2 decades?
It's been maybe a trend in the last 4 decades that there's been more polarization, and I don't think there's anyone has a great answer for why that is. People have tied it to increasing income inequality, so the idea that we're a more class-stratified society than we were 30 or 40 years ago, and as a result it makes sense for the parties to differentiate more on economic issues. Once the parties have differentiated on economic issues, perhaps they'll start to be more separate on other issues as well. I wouldn't say there's a great explanation, but as it is, more and more people are going to choose their party based on its ideology. And Arnold Schwarzenegger aside, typically, and other, at the national level, it's going to be harder to be a moderate, to be a liberal Republican or a conservative Democrat. It just doesn't seem like a reasonable option the way it used to be.
There are so many pundits, as we've talked about, whose predictions that you strike down with actual data in the book. Are there any pundits whose predictions or whose assessments of the world in the U.S., the political situations there, are there any of them who are actually whose predictions are verified by the data that you found?
Yeah, I think a lot of pundits have things to say. Like I wouldn't say that the value of a pundit is to offer predictions. And sometimes it's a matter of offering insight. Like, for example, David Brooks, I sort of, joke about a little bit because he talks about rich counties and poor counties, but I said if the comparisons you make in the East Coast wouldn't be so valid in Texas. But at the same time, I feel like he is capturing something. At least his discussion of red and blue America is real, and I'm using that as a starting off point. If you take his discussion and say, well, it's particularly valid among upper-income voters, it's valid in the East Coast, then you start to say, well, maybe you're learning something. And similarly with Thomas Frank, he had a lot of fascinating things to say about the rhetoric of conservatism and the history of the Republican Party in Kansas, and that's stuff that I wouldn't know about. I wouldn't say that he was personally spreading confusion. I think that he had a message which was easy to misinterpret. If you're trying to sell books and all, it's not so horrible to be misinterpreted and to have people think you're all things to all people. But I really do respect all the things that these reporters are telling us. My numbers wouldn't be interesting at all without that kind of human context.
How much of a goal was it in writing your book to avoid having a kind of large point that can be easily misinterpreted? I mean, I'm sure there's going to be somebody who misinterprets your books. Every book gets misinterpreted by someone, but was that something to avoid specifically for you?
The project started as a way, before we ever thought of writing a book, it started out as sort of an idea of debunking or even reconciliation. To say, well, there's red states and blue states, and that goes one way, and then there's rich voters and poor voters, and that goes the other way. So how can we sort of educate people and explain how that could be? And we had this idea in our head that the red states and blue states were sort of a silly thing where people get distracted by arbitrary state boundaries and not see the real pattern. But then we found that, as I said, I'll say it again since it's our key point, that the difference between red and blue America really is real. It just concentrated among the rich. And so I think that's a message that I hope couldn't be. I think the way that if I thought someone was going to misinterpret our thing, I think the classic way to misinterpret statistics is to assume that any number greater than 50% is 100%, and that any number below 50% is 0. So when I say rich people vote more Republican than poor people, misinterpretation would be to say that every rich person votes Republican or every poor person votes for the Democrat, and that's not true. But it is a struggle writing a book like this, because you can't qualify and hedge every statement, then it becomes incredibly boring. So to be dramatic without being misleading.
What would you think are the negative effects of the misconceptions, or the fact that the people hold the misconceptions that you try to exterminate in your book? What is the negative potential of these false ideas about what's dividing voters?
I think that the number one, well, first I should say this is pure speculation. For me to say what are the negative effects of these things would require some sort of surveys and experiments on voters that I haven't done. So just as a sort of citizen, I really objected to the idea of demonizing the other party, the idea of saying, well, Democrats are a bunch of trust funders and welfare cheats, and Republicans or conversely to say Republicans are a bunch of fat cats or Bible-thumping fools, right? So those are the stereotypes. And to disagree with the other party and their platform is quite reasonable. I think each party has various things there's a lot of good reasons to disagree with. But to say that the 50% of Americans who vote the other way are all a bunch of fools does seem poisonous to the political discourse. And that was one thing that I wanted to convey, that we wanted to convey in this book. People are mostly fairly moderate in their political views. They will mostly pick a party, and the party that's on the other side they're fairly distant from, and they're not such a big fan of that party. But it doesn't mean that all the voters from that party are somehow so different from them. I think the two-party system is fine. I don't think it would be good for the two parties to be identical, but we have to recognize that we're voting for these people to represent us, and therefore, if George Bush is elected and he represents the 51% of Americans who voted for him, I might not like what George Bush is doing, but it would be naive of me to think that the other 51%, would endorse all his policies if they were voting on them one at a time.
Since we're in speculation mode, I'd like to ask you this as well. Let's say that every voter in America read your book. Now, what would you like to see if that happened? What kind of political discourse, what kind of political climate would you expect to see? How different do you think it would be if everybody learned what you had to say, what the data had to say in your book?
I think if everybody read it, well, first I think they'd stop obsessing over the polls and things like political strategy and the political horse race. So I would hope that at least it would raise the level of discourse at that level. Also, I think maybe people would have a better sense of what the parties stand for. So, for example, Chuck Schumer, one of my two senators in New York, got a lot of bad press a few months, I guess it was close to a year ago, when he opposed a Democratic plan for raising taxes on the highest income people. It was some sort of, I don't remember the details, it was called the hedge fund tax. And people were saying, well, he's a Democrat, why is he all of a sudden being owned by these hedge fund people? Like, sure, they're in New York City, and he's in New York, but he's a Democrat. But if you actually look at who votes for Democrats in New York, Democrats get the votes of low-income, middle-income, and rich people in New York. So maybe it's not such a surprise that Chuck Schumer feels that the higher-income New Yorkers are his constituents, too. Now, conversely, if you look in Mississippi, you might say, why don't the Republicans, who most of the office holders in Mississippi are Republican, and conservative, why aren't they supporting higher welfare? Higher welfare, like a federal mandate to give more welfare payments to poor people. That would actually be good for the Mississippi economy. Mississippi has a lot of poor people. But if you look at who votes for these people, it's the highest income Mississippians vote for the Republicans there. The lowest income ones don't. And so a Republican office holder in Mississippi, by and large, is not going to want to do something that would piss off his key constituents. So that's the kind of understanding that you don't get if you just say, well, oh, New York, that's a rich state, therefore Democrats represent rich people. So therefore the Democrats are the party of the rich, therefore we shouldn't trust the Democrats, right? That's a logical set of logical statements that I don't agree with, and that there's, like, each step sounds right, but the key error is to say New York is a rich state, and therefore the Democrats represent rich people. They represent a range of voters in New York, and you don't get that. So that's what I'd like. I guess that's the fundamental thing I'd like for people to get out of this.
These all sound to me, as I remember back to my political science undergrad days, these all sound to me like common fallacies that social scientists talk about. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's actually names for these fallacies that people make. For example, thinking that a state being red or blue or some shade of purple indicates that any given voter is going to be the same composition. What are these fallacies specifically, technically?
Well, they have something called the ecological fallacy, which is not actually about ecology, but the idea that the fallacy being not to distinguish between individuals and their environment. And like another example would be if you say, well, not to give another example, but just to say there that being in a rich state doesn't make you rich, and characteristics of rich states are not necessarily characteristics of rich people. And so that's like, I think originally I did feel this project was along the lines of a debunking of me condescendingly telling the journalists that if only they knew a little statistics, they wouldn't make these errors. But as I said, I really learned when doing this that there was a lot to these observations, because your geography does matter too. And there's a tendency for social scientists to focus on for social scientists to focus on demographics, and for journalists to look at geography. And we found that who you are and where you are were both relevant.
In the book, I notice a whole lot of just a very strong respect for the data. It seems to be the overriding theme of the book is to not put any more on the data than is actually there. And this respect for the data, I mean, you must have certainly accrued a lot of it getting to the position you're in now, but how did you first gain it? How did that first become a theme of your career, is just taking the data as it is? And especially when you're writing a political book, that's got to be especially difficult to do because the environment of political books is not conducive to that.
Well, I guess a lot of it is just comparative advantage. That's what I know best, and other people are going to be better at telling stories. And there was a point at which we interviewed some voters, and that was actually in an early draft of the book. We interspersed interviews with regular voters, and some people said, well, these interviews are interesting, but no one's going to buy the book because of that. So I think I have to offer what I have to offer. I have strong political opinions, which I have no particular qualification for giving, and so I wouldn't do that. In some ways, we used the Freakonomics book as a model, in that that's a book of popular science that's about interesting things about life. We tried to do one better than them in that we actually display all our data. They'll say, well, we did this analysis and we did some sophisticated things. We can't really give them all the detail. We did some fancy stuff, and believe us. And I actually put quite a bit of effort into re-expressing our analysis in fairly direct forms. So underlying what we did was often some fairly sophisticated regression analysis, but we were usually able to abstract it and focus on the key graphs that would summarize it well. So it took a lot of work. It's a sort of statistical equivalent of saying, of like being able to write transparently or speak transparently, right? So if I tried to announce a baseball game, I would be gobbledygook, but like when Vin Scully does it, it sounds like he's just making it up as he goes along, but he's like obviously just incredibly, his brain can like work very fast and figure out how to say things so they're so clear. And that's how I feel about this, that we work so hard, to make it look easy.
There's all kinds of fascinating data in your book, and you say Freakonomics couldn't put their data in, but you could. What's the difference? Why couldn't they, whereas you found that you were able to?
They had many chapters that were, like, maybe our whole book would have been 2 chapters or something. So they covered a lot of different things, and their focus was more on this story. So if this book were 3 chapters in Freakonomics, they'd maybe talk about the rich and the poor voters in words, and then they'd say, why is this? And then they'd speculate. So we do a little speculation. We speculate that rich people can move to where they want to move. If you're rich and liberal, you might move to the California coast, and if you're rich and conservative, you might move to Atlanta. Poor people probably more likely to move locally, stay where they are, choose where to live based on where grandma is to help with the kids, so forth. 30 years ago, rich people may be less likely to just be able to move so freely. Maybe 30 years ago, richer, not rich, but upper income people may be more likely to be moved by their company. Things have changed. There have been social changes. And I would say that we talk about some of that. In a book like Freakonomics, they'd probably focus more on that. It's like they focus on the intellectual adventure. And my choice here, again, maybe a comparative advantage thing, was to just focus on what we really had hard data for. We have like 150 graphs in our book. Freakonomics could have had 150 graphs if they had chosen to do so, but that wasn't really their focus.
If you're just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. You can find our complete show archive at colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Andrew Gelman, professor of statistics at Columbia University and author of Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, Why Americans Vote the Way They Do. What are some of the main challenges, the toughest challenges you and your team encountered when trying to write a comparatively popular book coming from what I believe you've written before, which would be journal articles and political science journals and textbooks? What's the transition like from one to the other? What are the challenges there?
I wanted to be like Bill James, the baseball statistician. So my feeling was that the political junkie who reads the latest polls every day, right, reading the political equivalent of the box score, they want to know what's really happening. So I felt if we could convey that, if we could really have the hard numbers, then people would follow us along with everything else. So that's the model. I think we were able to make it readable partly because we use all the graphs. So we can go back and forth and say, the graph tells a story, and then we can say everything in words as well. But I think that writing 3 textbooks and writing a couple hundred journal articles does give you practice. I've had a blog for a few years, and so that's probably given me more practice writing in a more relaxed way. And I do think that as I've sort of gotten older, I've maybe been able to write more directly. It's a real challenge. When I teach my students, even something technical, to say just write exactly what you did. It's very hard for people to do that.
This phenomenon of academics that blog, and I talk to a lot of them on this show who engage in this new phenomenon. What, as an academic, does blogging bring you in the course of your career? What dimension does it add to be an academic/blogger rather than just an academic working in a university setting?
Well, we originally set up the blog as a way to communicate in our research group. So it was supposed to be that it was just a way for us to put ideas down. I mean, for me, the biggest advantage of the blog is I put it down. It's just like a diary practically. I put something down and I don't have to think about it anymore. It plays the role that Xeroxing used to play. So I used to, if I had to read some journal article, I'd Xerox it, and then I'd feel like I didn't have to think about it anymore. But then, once you get an audience, we have a few thousand readers a day, and so knowing that you're writing something that someone will read, I think changes how you think a little bit. And it's just a cross-section of people that I wouldn't otherwise encounter.
And that's what I was going to ask. How much does an audience of non-academics as well on the blog bring to it? What's the benefit in that for you, having a non-academic audience?
I think that most of the audience, and if they're not academic, they have some interest in politics or in statistics. So it's good to communicate with them in some way. It doesn't really even matter to me if someone's academic or not. I mean, if they're not in my classes, right? They're just other people. Sometimes you're also, it is a way to communicate with other bloggers. So there is there is, in that sense, some sort of community where when I posted something recently about why Sarah Palin isn't as popular as one might think, because she's from a small state, and governors of small states tend to be more popular than governors of big states. So I put that on the blog, and then it got picked up by other blogs. So that was some way in which I felt I was contributing to the discourse. Since I don't have a brother-in-law who's the editor of the New York Times or whatever, that's actually one way that I can get ideas out there.
This brings me to the subject of the 2008 election, and as you said when we were talking earlier about visions of the future where everybody has red state, blue state, rich state, poor state, you talked about a minimizing of the horse race element of politics. And in 2008, there has been certainly the excitement of many, many horse races all rolled into one. Now, I take it that you have been asked to, even just in conversation, apply the implications of your research to what's going on now in the U.S. presidential political atmosphere. And how do you tie that in?
The way I tie it in is that people, at the aggregate and the individual level, people's votes are fairly predictable based on economic attitudes and economic conditions. So that fits into the general theme of the book, that there is a fair amount of class-based voting, and to the extent voting isn't class-based, religion is a key predictor too, and how the states are different from each other. When people ask about the horse race per se, I usually tell them that the latest polls are not very informative. When you get very close to the election, the polls are telling you something. But when you're talking about the general election, there's enough history of people voting for Democrats and Republicans that you can predict. I can't tell you I know who's going to win ahead of time, but you can certainly say what the history would tell you. And one thing the history tells you is that polls a couple months out aren't super informative. Now we're getting closer, and the polls are actually getting pretty close to the forecast.
So someone who wanted to find out or wanted to predict, wanted to say, play the political betting markets, wanted to know what was going to happen in 2008, would do better not to keep a close eye on the polls, but to keep a close eye on history, which would tell them how much the polls can't tell them then.
I think so. The primary election's another story, because the primary election, you don't have that sort of history. That's not, you'll have a set of candidates, an unstable situation with a set of candidates with similar ideologies. It's going to be a lot harder to predict in advance. And also, if I were a candidate, I would follow the polls, because the candidates, they're trying different strategies, and the election's predictable because the campaigns are knocking each other out and trying to make a difference. If one side just stopped campaigning, I don't think it would be good for them at all. So they need to do that. But just thinking of the larger point, maybe, like, what would people get, out of reading my book? Once again, take the analogy to Freakonomics. What do you learn from reading Freakonomics? Well, you learn that sumo wrestlers cheat and a few other things like that. But I think the key message that all sorts of readers, including students and my mom even, got out of Freakonomics was, look, there's a way of looking at the world, right? If you look at people's incentives, you can analyze some data, and you can learn surprising things. And so it's a data-friendly message, even though it's not a data-heavy book. In that sense, I think the key message from our book, the key, not political message, but sort of way of thinking about life message, is that history tells you a lot. That there's a lot of speculation is based on false claims. A lot of things that you could actually check by looking at the numbers, and a lot of political claims are based on a long logical chains of arguments that have broken links in them, and a lot can be gained by going back and seeing what's been happening in the past.
About the examples of statistical illiteracy that we've seen recently in the 2008 election, you mentioned just a little while ago the assumptions about Sarah Palin's popularity and that they are on the high side because of the size of the state she comes from. What's at work there statistically?
Statistically, I was just curious because I have a friend from Alaska, and he wrote a long email to a bunch of people where he talked about how he thought Sarah Palin was pretty good. He thought he doesn't live in Alaska now, but he's read the papers, and he thought that she had really done a lot in a short amount of time. He was impressed, and he said, what I'm really impressed by is she has this sky-high popularity, and Alaskans are pretty ornery, and if she was a rebel and everybody likes her, that's got to be a good sign. So nowadays in the era of Google, things are a lot easier than when I started doing research 20 years ago. You can't believe the amount of effort we had to do to clean up polls and so forth. So I went on Google, and you could see governors' popularity ratings from 2008, and then I found a different page with a different survey organization with all the 50 governors from 2006. And I was wondering about state size, so I made a little graph for each year plotting the approval rating for the governor versus the population of the state, and it just jumped out. The most popular governors were from small states, like I think North Dakota, Utah, a bunch of other ones. And in fact, it's not just the Republicans sort of benefiting from this. Also, one of the Democratic Party's rising stars, Brian Schweitzer of Montana, he's very popular, and Montana, of course, is another small state. Now, I don't have to tell you in California that it's not easy to be a popular governor of California. And
no.
Every state is its own story, but maybe it is no coincidence that the large states, that none of the governors are especially popular. It's just not so easy. And in a way, you could say that's ironic, because being a governor of a large state might be a better preparation for chief officer of the United States than being governor of a small state. But you don't get that sort of universal popularity. But yeah, it was just a couple Googles, and I made some graphs, and so it's sort of scary that you can do that and learn stuff, but sometimes it works out like that.
That makes it a very good time for social scientists, does it not?
Yeah, well, we're sort of afraid that other people are going to figure this out. That's what I thought about our book. It was pretty simple what we did, looking at the role of income and voting in different states. It's funny that people hadn't done it before, but I'm sure it'll happen. And once again, we're sending this message that you can do this. So I think there's a lot of people out there trying to do it. They're just looking not quite in the right place. So people just obsessing on the polls, that's not the right place to look always, is like who happens to be up and who happens to be down. But the data are just all over the place, and certainly political operatives are very aware of a lot of these things. They're out there targeting, doing micro-targeting, and they know tons of stuff that I don't know at all.
And that was something that I wanted to make sure to ask you, is what you just said. You said you were wondering why nobody had done it before, and I was wondering the same thing. This seems like a simple conclusion to reach, this paradox of your book where rich states go Democratic, rich voters go Republican. How could that have eluded the political scientists or any kind of social scientist grasp for so long?
Well, the pattern of rich states going Democratic has been increasing. It wasn't there in the 70s, and it's been gradually appearing in the past couple of decades. So it would have been hard for someone to notice it. Even before 2000, it wasn't such a strong pattern. But I think there's a tendency to dismiss journalists, to say that's a silly thing, like the red-blue map. It's like a big joke, because after all, most of the states are purple, and so maybe a tendency not to take it so seriously. And as I said, even for me, it was really started as a bit of almost a teaching exercise, and then I learned that there was a lot going on there. And the idea that it actually has implications for things like the opiate of the elites and all that was just morally a matter of us following the data and seeing where it led us.
From your position as a professor of statistics, I wanted to make sure to know from you, what do you make, or what's your assessment of statistical literacy in the American public today? Is it good, medium, bad, and where is it? How literate are we statistically?
I don't know what's the appropriate comparison. There are just horrible stories out there, like we have mentioned in the book, the foreign aid paradox, that most Americans think that we should cut foreign aid, that it should be a much lower percentage of our budget. Instead of being 15% of the budget, maybe it should be 3% of the budget. But actually, foreign aid is less than 1% of the federal budget. So does that mean that people want much less foreign aid, or does it mean they want 3%, which is much more than we have? Like, how do you even know? And that's these are, in a sense, these are basic numbers people are willing to express an opinion on, and it probably doesn't help that politicians will sometimes want to exaggerate things. The average American thinks that 25% of Americans are black, but it's actually 12%. So how does that affect things? How does it affect things if you're black and you think that you're less of a minority than you are? How does it affect it if you're white and you think that blacks are more present than they are? In European societies and in America as well, people think there are like twice as many immigrants as there really are. Now, what's that all? That's not just, maybe you could say people in San Diego think there are lots of immigrants, but people all over the country, like somehow you either live where there are a lot of immigrants and you think there's a lot, or you live where there aren't and you think there's a lot somewhere else. I don't really know the solution to it in the sense ultimately the voter's responsibility is to pick representatives, right, not to make decisions.
How often in the discipline of statistics do you run into these situations where it starts to bleed into psychology? It seems to get almost half and half stats, half psychology at a certain point when you talk about human biases. How much do you deal with psychological material when you're in the course of statistics research?
I'm in awe of psychologists because they, with the same ease that I will run a regression analysis or make a graph, a psychologist will do an experiment. And it's very hard. I tried to do an experiment recently to understand people's misperceptions of political facts, and we set up this online experiment, and then our results were all garbage. It was all useless because we didn't really ask the questions right. So it's tough. I mean, to do psychology research requires a technical understanding of how to actually gather reasonable data from human beings, and that I have a huge amount of respect for.
It's something that you would not call your comparative advantage?
It's not my comparative advantage at all. It was funny because I just thought, how hard could it be? But then I thought, well, I've been analyzing data for 25 years, and I was probably always pretty good at it, and I haven't been doing experiments, and I'm probably not so naturally talented at it. So it's a good, humbling experience. Good for me.
What do you think are the most important statistical concepts for people to know? And I mean just people reading the news, people trying to make sense of the world, people trying to make sense of statistics that they read in the newspaper because they're all too often, it's easy to misread them. What should people know when they're reading these? For me, I think the most important thing is to be able to trace the numbers to their source. Even something as simple, someone says, if you have more education, you make more money, then like, well, how are these things measured? Like, where the data come from? Like that kind of critical thinking. But it's difficult, right? There's always some amount of trust that's required. But I think that if you can't, like, at least conceptually trace the numbers back to their sources, then you're going to have problems. Why do you think people don't generally tend to do that or to think in that way? Well, psychologists have found it's not natural for humans to think that way. I went to a talk recently by a psychologist who studies how children and adults learn about the world, and he talked about evolutionary trees. Right? There are studies where they describe different animals and plants to people and ask them to describe what's closer to what, and then they can reconstruct. The idea was that they could reconstruct the implicit evolutionary tree that somebody saw. So, like, for example, pandas are close to raccoons, but they look like bears. So if you gather data from people, there will be sort of an implicit tree in which pandas are close to bears, even if they aren't. So you can learn, like, what people think. And in his talk, he discussed all this, and then he said, but even if people who've learned evolution actually think of nature in terms of an older view, what he called the Great Chain of Being, which is, at the bottom there's rocks and inanimate objects, and then there are plants, and then there are things like bacteria, and then like animals like jellyfish that can't do much, and then things like fish, and moving your way up to monkeys, and then humans, which are the top. And when he told us that, I realized that's how I learned biology in 9th grade, that we learned all about evolution, but all the animals are presented in an order. And it was years later that I was shocked
when I found out that there are some birds that are, like parrots, are smarter in many ways than a lot of mammals, like it just threw me for a loop. I didn't know how to think about, because I had always learned that, I'd always sort of implicitly sort of swallowed the dogma that all mammals are higher than all birds because we're mammals, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is like the human, we're not built to understand statistics, right? We're built to be able to find bananas in trees and stuff like that. So it's a great human achievement to be able to quantify things. I have a colleague, Howard Weiner, he's written many books about statistical graphics, and he pointed out that the scatter plot, or scatter plot, a graph where I have like one dot for each state, like I told you about Sarah Palin, so forth, that was not invented till the 1800s, or maybe I think it was the 1800s. Some sort of basic idea to us, but it's not natural for people to quantify in that way.
How central to being a critical thinker would you say it is to cast off these mental models that don't really apply to our world?
I mean, people say you have to recognize your own biases, so I guess that's part of it. I think it just depends on what area you're working in. I mean, I've tended to work in areas, like I'm working in political science, and I've worked in areas like the death penalty and criminology, but the stuff I do doesn't really have a advocacy feel to it. And so in a way, I've been lucky enough not to have to worry so much about my own biases. If you're a researcher and you're studying the benefits of privatized prisons, or something that's very hot in the news in terms of maybe a certain health care plan, then I think it's much harder. Then you probably have to recognize your own bias and just present your work as being somewhat of an advocate.
Now, we're almost out of time here, but I just wanted to ask you one more thing, and that is, what data is the most interesting data to you right now to examine, now that this book is out? What's fascinating you in the world of data currently?
Well, in the world of election data, I think what I really like to understand is what's happening inside states. So there's this saying that Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh on one end, Philadelphia on the other, and Alabama in the middle. And similarly, just about every state has its urban areas and its redneck areas. And that's I think really the next thing to study, to go beyond states and to get inside. And I told you a little bit about our preliminary results from California, but to look at that in all 50 states.
Any chance that'll be the next book?
I don't know. I think the next book, I think I wouldn't mind writing a book about how the differences between large and small states, because there's all these things that small states get extra money from the government, and they get extra senators and extra representatives and extra electoral votes, and they even got the vice presidential nominees of both parties. And so I think maybe that's something that would be worth looking into.
Now that you're bringing up, that really is a question that I want to know the answer to too. But the book people can buy now is Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State. Andrew Gelman, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Oh, it was a pleasure.
For more information on Andrew Gelman and Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, visit redbluerichpoor.com. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his stuff at benalthouse.com. Find out more about the Marketplace of Ideas or visit our online show archive at colinmarshallradio.com.